Okay. 안녕하세요. How are you today? All right. Today we're reading chapter 16. The chapter is called Diana is Invited to Tea with Tragic Results. 네, I don't know if you guys have watched Anne with an E on Netflix. 그런데 많은 부분들이 비슷한 부분도 있지만 완전히 다른 부분도 있었고 네. 그런데 this chapter는 나왔나요? 나왔던 것 같아요. 그쵸? Alright. 해보겠습니다. October was a beautiful month at Green Gables, when the birches in the hollow turned as golden as sunshine, and the maples behind the orchard were royal crimson, and the wild cherry trees along the lane put on the loveliest shades of dark red and bronzy green, while the fields sunned themselves in aftermaths. Anne reveled in the world of color about her. "Oh, Marilla," she exclaimed one Saturday morning, coming dancing in with her arms full of gorgeous bows, "I'm so glad I live in a world where there are Octobers. It would be terrible if we just skipped from September to November, wouldn't it? Look at these maple branches. Don't they give you a thrill? Several thrills? I'm going to decorate my room with them." 네, October, 10월 달이 있는 세상에 살아서 너무 즐겁지 않습니까? 그냥 9월 달에서 바로 11월로 가면 얼마나 안 좋겠어요. 그리고 인제 나무 가지들을 가지고 왔어요. "Messy things," said Marilla, whose aesthetic sense was not noticeably developed. "You clutter up your room entirely too much with out-of-door stuff, Anne. Bedrooms were made to sleep in." 네, aesthetic sense. 네, 미에 대한 감각이 별로 발달이 안 됐다는 거죠. "Oh, and dreamin' too, Marilla. And you know one can dream so much better in a room where there are pretty things. I'm going to put these bows in the old blue jug and set them on my table." "Mind you don't drop leaves all over the stairs then. I'm going to a meeting of the Aid Society at Carmody this afternoon, Anne, and I won't likely be home before dark. You'll have to get Matthew and Jerry their supper, so mind you don't forget to put the tea to draw until you sit down at the table as you did last time." 티를 까먹지 말라고 했어요. 저번에처럼. "It was dreadful of me to forget," said Anne apologetically. "But that was the afternoon I was trying to think of a name for Violet Vale, and it crowded other things out. Matthew was so good. He never scolded a bit. He put the tea down himself and said we could wait a while as well as not. And I told him a lovely fairy story while we were waiting, so he didn't find the time long at all." 네, 티를 빨리 미리 안 해가지고 기다려야 됐었죠. 그리고 기다리는 동안 자기가 fairy에 대해서 요정에 대해서 얘기를 해줬어요. "It was a beautiful fairy story, Marilla. I forgot the end of it, so I made up an end for it myself, and Matthew said he couldn't tell where the join came in." 네, 끝을 까먹어서 자기가 냈는데 매튜는 어디서부터 자기 이야기가 시작했는지 몰랐대요. 너무 좋아서. "Matthew would think it all right, Anne, if you took a notion to get up and have dinner in the middle of the night. But you keep your wits about you this time. And I don't really know if I'm doing right. It may make you more addlepated than ever, but you can ask Diana to come over and spend the afternoon with you and have tea here." 매튜는 네가 밤에 점심 먹자 그래도 새벽에 여기서 말하는 dinner는 저녁이라고 안 하고 점심인 것 같아요. 항상 아침에 dinner를 먹으니까. 네. 새벽에 갑자기 밥을 먹자 그래도 좋다고 할 거예요. "근데 내가 가 있는 동안 다이아나를 초대하는 건 어때?" 네. 하지만 그렇게 했다가는 너가 더 "You're gonna be more addlepated." 머리가 더 혼란해지겠지? 하지만 네. 초대하라고. "Oh, Marilla," Anne clasped her hands. "How perfectly lovely! You are able to imagine things after all, or else you'd never have understood how I've longed for that very thing. It will seem so nice and grown-uppish. No fear of my forgetting to put the tea to draw when I have company. Oh, Marilla, can I use the rosebud spray tea set? 네. 아, 상상력이 있군요. 네. Grown up. 그냥 so grown up 이렇게만 해도 되는데 grown up-ish 이렇게 말을 했어요. Marilla의 rosebud spray tea set 쓸 수도 있겠냐고 했더니 No, indeed. The rosebud tea set? Well, what next? You know I never use that except for the minister or the aides. You'll put down the old brown tea set, but you can open the little yellow crock of cherry preserves. It's time it was being used anyhow. I believe it's beginning to work. And you can cut some fruit cake and have some of the cookies and snaps. I can just imagine myself sitting down at the head of the table and pouring out the tea, said Anne, shutting her eyes ecstatically, and asking Diana if she takes sugar. I know she doesn't, but of course I'll ask her just as if I didn't know, and then pressing her to take another piece of fruit cake and another helping of preserves. Oh, Marilla, it's a wonderful sensation just to think of it. Can I take her into the spare room to lay off her hat when she comes, and then into the parlor to sit? 응접실로 데려갈 수 있느냐고 물어봤죠. No, the sitting room will do for you and your company. company는 여기서 회사가 아니라 company, 손님이죠. But there's a bottle half full of raspberry cordial that was left over from the church social the other night. It's on the second shelf of the sitting room closet, and you and Diana can have it if you like, and a cookie to eat with it along in the afternoon, for I dare say Matthew will be late coming into tea since he's hauling potatoes to the vessel. 네, raspberry는 산딸기고 cordial, 과일 주스로 만들어서 물을 타서 마시는 음료수입니다. Anne flew down to the hollow, past the Dryad's bubble, and up the spruce path to Orchard Slope to ask Diana to tea. As a result, just after Marilla had driven off to Carmody, Diana came over, dressed in her second best dress, and looking exactly as it is proper to look when asked out to tea. At other times, she was wont to run into the kitchen without knocking, but now she knocked primly at the front door. 네, 원래는 그냥 막 쳐들어오는데 오늘은 딱 되게 얌전하게 문을 똑똑했대요. And when Anne, dressed in her second best, as primly opened it, both little girls shook hands as gravely as if they had never met before. This unnatural solemnity lasted until after Diana had been taken to the east gable to lay off her hat, and then had sat for 10 minutes in the sitting room, toes in position. 네, unnatural, 부자연스러운, 자연스럽지 못한 근엄함, 엄숙함이 언제까지 있었대요? 자기 방으로 데려가서 모자 내려놓고 그 다음에 sitting room에서 이렇게 toes in position, 발가락을 딱 이렇게 잘 모아진 상태에 있는 상태에서 10분 동안 그렇게 앉고 나서 이제 끝났대요. Until after, right. How is your mother? Inquired Anne politely, just as if she had not seen Mrs. Barry picking apples that morning in excellent health and spirits. 네. 엄마는 좀 어떠신가요? 근데 바로 오늘 안 본 것처럼 사과를 그날 아침에 사과 팩하고 따고 in excellent health and spirits. 건강과 기분이 아주 좋은 상태로 보지 않았던 것처럼 She is very well, thank you. I suppose Mr. Cuthbert is hauling potatoes to the Lily Sands this afternoon, is he? Said Diana, who had ridden down to Mr. Harmon Andrews that morning in Matthew's cart. Yes, our potato crop is very good this year. I hope your father's potato crop is good too. It is fairly good, thank you. Have you picked many of your apples yet? Oh, ever so many, said Anne, forgetting to be dignified and jumping up quickly. Let's go out to the orchard and get some of the red sweetings, Diana. Marilla says we can have all that are left on the tree. Marilla is a very generous woman. She said we could have fruit cake and cherry preserves for tea. 네, 여기서 get some of the red sweetings라고 했죠. 그러면 뭘 것 같아요? 일단 orchard라고 했으니까 과수원, 과일인 거 알겠고 또 red sweetings, 이름이에요. 뭐의 이름일까요? 사과의 이름. Okay. But it isn't good manners to tell your company what you're going to give them to eat, so I won't tell you what she said we could have to drink. Only it begins with an R and a C, and it's a bright red color. I love bright red drinks, don't you? They taste twice as good as any other color. The orchard, with its great sweeping boughs that bent to the ground with fruit, proved so delightful that the little girl spent most of the afternoon in it, sitting in a grassy corner where the frost had spared the green and the mellow autumn sunshine lingered warmly, eating apples and talking as hard as they could. Diana had much to tell Anne of what went on in school. She had to sit with Gertie Pye, and she hated it. Gertie squeaked her pencil all the time, and it just made her Diana's blood run cold. 네, 소름 끼쳤다는 거죠. 왜냐? 연필을 막 찍찍 이렇게 이상하게 해가지고 왜냐하면 종이에다 쓰는 게 아니었잖아요, 그죠? 길버트 블라이트 머리 위에다가 깨트린 거, 그 슬레이트에다가 항상 이렇게 연필을 찍찍 그었다는 거예요. Ruby Gillis had charmed all her warts away, true's you live, with a magic pebble that old Mary Joe from the creek gave her. You had to rub the warts with the pebble and then throw it away over your left shoulder at the time of the new moon, and the warts would all go. wart는 음, 혹? 물혹? 네, 혹입니다. 사마귀 같은 거? Yeah. Charlie Sloane's name was written up with M. White's on the porch wall, and M. White was awful mad about it. Sam Bolter had sassed Mr. Phillips in class, and Mr. Phillips whipped him, and Sam's father came down to the school and dared Mr. Phillips to lay a hand on one of his children again. And Mattie Andrews had a new red hood and a blue crossover with tassels on it, and the airs she put on about it were perfectly sickening. And Lizzie Wright didn't speak to Mamie Wilson because Mamie Wilson's grown-up sister had cut out Lizzie Wright's grown-up sister with her bow. And everybody missed Anne so and wished she'd come to school again. And Gilbert Blythe, but Anne didn't want to hear about Gilbert Blythe. She jumped up hurriedly and said, suppose they go in and have some raspberry cordial. 네, 우리 지금은 일어날 수 없는 일이 있었죠. Mr. Phillips가 whipped Sam Bolter because he had sassed Mr. Phillips. 막 대들어서 때려줬더니 어떻게 됐대요? Sam Bolter's father came to school and 한 번만 다시 해봐. 이렇게 dared him to do it again. Dared him to lay a hand on one of his children again. 네, 지금은 그런 일이 있을 수가 없죠. 네, 그리고 길버트에 대해서 얘기를 하려고 그러자마자 난 길버트에 대해서는 듣기 싫어 했어요. Anne looked on the second shelf of the sitting room pantry, but there was no bottle of raspberry cordial there. Search revealed it way back on the top shelf. Anne put it on a tray and set it on the table with a tumbler. Now, please help yourself, Diana, she said politely. I don't believe I'll have any just now. I don't feel as if I wanted any after all those apples. 사과를 너무 많이 먹어가지고 나는 못 마시겠어. 너만 마셔. Diana poured herself out a tumblerful, looked at its bright red hue admiringly, and then sipped it daintily. 그냥 꼴꺽꼴꺽 이렇게 마신 게 아니라 아주 이렇게 마셨대요. That's awfully nice raspberry cordial, Anne, she said. I didn't know raspberry cordial was so nice. I'm real glad you like it. Take as much as you want. I'm going to run out and stir the fire up. There are so many responsibilities on a person's mind when they're keeping house, isn't there? Keeping house. 집안일을 하면 너무 신경 쓸 게 많네요. 이렇게 말을 했어요. When Anne came back from the kitchen, Diana was drinking her second glassful of cordial, and being entreated thereto by Anne, she offered no particular objection to the drinking of a third. Objection은 반대죠. 하나 더 마셔 그랬더니 반대를 안 했어요. The tumblerfuls were generous ones, and the raspberry cordial was certainly very nice. 네, the tumblerfuls were generous ones. 이거는 컵에다가 그냥 반만 채운다든지 조금만 채운 게 아니라 그냥 가득 채웠다는 거예요. The nicest I ever drank, said Diana. It's ever so much nicer than Mrs. Lynde's, although she brags of hers so much. It doesn't taste a bit like hers. Mrs. Linde의 raspberry cordial보다 훨씬 맛있는데? 되게 자랑을 하지만 I should think Marilla's raspberry cordial would probably be much nicer than Mrs. Lynde's, said Anne loyally. 충성스럽게 당연히 Marilla 거가 더 맛있지. Marilla is a famous cook. She is trying to teach me to cook, but I assure you, Diana, it is uphill work. 네, what is uphill? hill는 언덕이죠. 네, uphill는 가기 어려울까요? 쉬울까요? 네, 어렵죠. 그러니까 오르막길이야. 엄청 어려워. Marilla가 나를 요리하는 걸 가르쳐 주고 있는데 정말 어려운 일이야. There's so little scope for imagination in cookery. You just have to go by rules. The last time I made a cake, I forgot to put the flour in. I was thinking the loveliest story about you and me, Diana. I thought you were desperately ill with smallpox and everybody deserted you, but I went boldly to your bedside and nursed you back to life. And then I took the smallpox and died, and I was buried under those poplar trees in the graveyard, and you planted a rose bush by my grave and watered it with your tears. And you never, never forgot the friend of your youth who sacrificed her life for you. Oh, it was such a pathetic tale, Diana. The tears just rained down over my cheeks while I mixed the cake. 네, 혼자서 케이크를 만들고 있는데, 섞고 있는데, 생각을 하니까 다이아나가 smallpox, 감염이 잘 되는, 네, smallpox는, what was it called? I forget. 네, 아무튼 되게 감염이 잘 되는 병이 걸려서 다들 떠났지만 자기가 위험을 무릅쓰고 가서 돌봤는데 자기가 아파서 죽었다는 생각을 하면서 울었다는 거예요. But I forgot the flour, and the cake was a dismal failure. Flour is so essential to cakes, you know. 밀가루는 케이크에 아주 필수적이야, 알지? Marilla was very cross, and I don't wonder. I'm a great trial to her. She was terribly mortified about the pudding sauce last week. We had a plum pudding for dinner on Tuesday, and there was half the pudding and a pitcher full of sauce left over. Marilla said there was enough for another dinner and told me to set it on the pantry shelf and cover it. 덮어서 어디다 잘 놓으라 그랬어요. I meant to cover it just as much as could be, Diana, but when I carried it in, I was imagining I was a nun. Of course I'm a Protestant, but I imagined I was a Catholic, taking the veil to bury a broken heart in cloistered seclusion, and I forgot all about covering the pudding sauce. I thought of it next morning and ran to the pantry. 그 다음날 생각났어요. 덮는 거를, pudding sauce를. Diana, fancy if you can my extreme horror at finding a mouse drowned in that pudding sauce. 네, 생쥐가 거기에 빠져서 죽어 있었대요. I lifted the mouse out with a spoon and threw it out in the yard, and then I washed the spoon in 3 waters. Marilla was out milking, and I fully intended to ask her when she came in if I'd give the sauce to the pigs. But when she did come in, I was imagining that I was a frost fairy going through the woods turning the trees red and yellow, whichever they wanted to be, so I never thought about the pudding sauce again, and Marilla sent me out to pick apples. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Chester Ross from Spencervale came here that morning. You know they are very stylish people, especially Mrs. Chester Ross. When Marilla called me in, dinner was all ready, and everybody was at the table. I tried to be as polite and dignified as I could be, for I wanted Mrs. Chester Ross to think I was a ladylike little girl, even if I wasn't pretty. 네, 손님이 왔대요. Mr. Chester Ross and Mrs. Chester Ross가 왔는데 자기는 푸딩 소스에 대해서 완전히 까먹은 거죠. 사과를 따라 그래가지고. 그래서 이 손님들이 너무 점잖은 사람들이라서 자기도 되게 예의 바르고 품위 있게 하고 싶었대요. 왜냐하면 자기 이쁘진 않아도 되게 숙녀처럼 점잖게 하고 싶었던 거죠. Everything went right until I saw Marilla coming with the plum pudding in one hand and the pitcher of pudding sauce warmed up in the other. Diana, that was a terrible moment. I remembered everything and I just stood up in my place and shrieked out, Marilla, you mustn't use that pudding sauce. There was a mouse drowned in it. I forgot to tell you before. 그때 생각이 나서 그때 얘기한 거죠. Oh, Diana, I shall never forget that awful moment if I live to be 100. Mrs. Chester Ross just looked at me, and I thought I would sink through the floor with mortification. Mrs. Ross가 자기를 쳐다봐서 자기 너무 망신스러워서 치욕스러워서 그냥 바닥으로 내려앉을 것 같았다고요. She is such a perfect housekeeper, and fancy what she must have thought of us. Marilla turned red as fire. 얼굴이 완전히 시뻘개졌다는 거죠. But she never said a word then. 그때는 한마디도 말을 안 했어요. She just carried that sauce and pudding out and brought in some strawberry preserves. She even offered me some, but I couldn't swallow a mouthful. It was like heaping coals of fire on my head. 네, heaping coals of fire. 이게 무슨 뜻일까요? 네, 누가 원수에게 은혜로 갚아주는 거예요. 그래서 남을 부끄럽게 한다는 거죠. 왜냐면 혼내질 않고 그냥 이거 먹을래? 아무 소리 안 하고 하니까 너무 창피해서. After Mrs. Chester Ross went away, Marilla gave me a dreadful scolding. Why, Diana, what is the matter? 네, 여태까지 앤이 계속 혼자서 말을 하는데 다이아나는 여태까지 한 번도 말을 안 했죠. Diana had stood up very unsteadily. Then she sat down again, putting her hands to her head. I'm I am awful sick, she said a little thickly. I must go right home. Oh, you mustn't dream of going home without your tea, cried Anne in distress. I'll get it right off. I'll go and put the tea down this very minute. I must go home, repeated Diana, stupidly, but determinedly. Let me get you a lunch anyhow, implored Anne. Let me give you a bit of fruit cake and some of the cherry preserves. Lie down on the sofa for a little while, and you'll be better. Where do you feel bad? 가지 말라고. 점심 먹고 가라고. 티 마시고 가라고. I must go home, said Diana, and that was all she would say. In vain, Anne pleaded. In vain. 헛되이. I never heard of company going home without tea, she mourned. Oh, Diana, do you suppose that it's possible you're really taking the smallpox? 네, smallpox가 천연두라고 했네요. If you are, I'll go and nurse you. You can depend on that. I'll never forsake you. 난 너를 버리지 않을 거야. 너가 아프다 해도. But I do wish you'd stay till after tea. Where do you feel bad? I'm awful dizzy, said Diana, and indeed she walked very dizzily. Anne, with tears of disappointment in her eyes, got Diana's hat and went with her as far as the Barry yard fence. Then she wept all the way back to Green Gables, where she sorrowfully put the remainder of the raspberry cordial back into the pantry and got tea ready for Matthew and Jerry, with all the zest gone out of the performance. The next day was Sunday, and as the rain poured down in torrents from dawn till dusk, Anne did not stir abroad from Green Gables. Monday afternoon, Marilla sent her down to Mrs. Lynde's on an errand. 심부름으로 Mrs. Lynde에게 보냈어요. In a very short space of time, Anne came flying back up the lane with tears rolling down her cheeks. Into the kitchen she dashed and flung herself face downward on the sofa in an agony. Whatever has gone wrong now, Anne? Queried Marilla in doubt and dismay. I do hope you haven't gone and been saucy to Mrs. Lynde again. 또 왜 그러는 거야? Mrs. Lynde에게 또 대들었어? Mrs. Lynde랑 싸웠어? No answer from Anne save more tears and stormier sobs. Anne Shirley, when I ask you a question, I want to be answered. Sit right up this very minute and tell me what you are crying about. Anne sat up, tragedy personified. 네, 비극을 의인회하다. 비극이 사람이었다면 Anne이었다는 거죠. Mrs. Lynde was up to see Mrs. Barry today, and Mrs. Barry was in an awful state, she wailed. She says that I set Diana drunk Saturday and sent her home in a disgraceful condition, and she says I must be a thoroughly bad, wicked little girl, and she's never going to let Diana play with me again. Oh, Marilla, I'm just overcome with woe. 네, 다이아나를 술 취하게 만들어서 완전히 수치스러운 상태로 보냈다는 거예요. 나는 비에 압도당했다. 난 너무너무 슬퍼. 라는 말을 이렇게 했네요. Marilla stared in blank amazement. Set Diana drunk, she said when she found her voice. Anne, are you or Mrs. Barry crazy? What on earth did you give her? Not a thing but raspberry cordial, sobbed Anne. I never thought raspberry cordial would set people drunk, Marilla, not even if they drank 3 big tumblerfuls as Diana did. Oh, it sounds so like Mrs. Thomas's husband. But I didn't mean to set her drunk. Drunk fiddlesticks, said Marilla, marching to the sitting room pantry. There on the shelf was a bottle which she at once recognized as one containing some of her 3-year-old homemade currant wine for which she was celebrated in Avonlea, although certain of the stricter sort, Mrs. Barry among them, disapproved strongly of it. And at the same time, Marilla recollected that she had put the bottle of raspberry cordial down in the cellar instead of in the pantry, as she had told Anne. 네. So this is a very long sentence. 자기가 라스베리 코르절을 그 식료품 저장실에다가 넣었다고 생각을 했는데 이렇게 1층에 거기다 놨다고 생각했는데 거기를 봤더니 자기가 만드는 술, 베리 종류의 술만 있었던 거예요. 보세요, 여기. Which she was celebrated, for which she was celebrated in Avonlea. 그래서 Avonlea에서 그 술로 조금 유명하다는 거예요. 너무 맛있어서, 술을 너무 맛있게 만들어서. Although certain of the stricter sort, Mrs. Barry among them. 그러니까 미국에서도 그렇고 Prohibition era가 있었어요. 술을 마시고 팔고 하는 게 불법이었을 경우가 때가 있었는데 이때도 캐나다에서는 그럴 때였나 봐요. 그래서 strict 아주 엄격한 사람들 몇 명은 되게 그거를 반대했다는 거예요. Alright. 네, 샬럿님 안녕하세요. 반갑습니다. Alright. She went back to the kitchen with the wine bottle in her hand. Her face was twitching in spite of herself. 네, twitching은 이렇게 막 웃음을 참을 때 twitching 한다는 거죠. And you certainly have a genius for getting into trouble. You went and gave Diana currant wine instead of raspberry cordial. Didn't you know the difference yourself? 차이를 몰랐어? raspberry cordial이랑 술이랑? I never tasted it, said Anne. I thought it was the cordial. I meant to be so hospitable. Diana got awfully sick and had to go home. Mrs. Barry told Mrs. Lynde she was simply dead drunk. She just laughed silly like when her mother asked her what was the matter and went to sleep and slept for hours. Her mother smelled her breath and knew she was drunk. She had a fearful headache all day yesterday. Mrs. Barry is so indignant. She will never believe but what I did it on purpose. 네, hospitable는 우대, 손님 대접을 잘하고 싶었다는 거죠. I meant to be so hospitable. 그래서 hospitality도 되게 친절하다는 건데 그 hospitality industry도 호텔 혹은 음식 종류, travel, tourism 이런 것들이 다 hospitality industry입니다. 네, 배청님도 안녕하세요. I should think she would better punish Diana for being so greedy as to drink 3 glassfuls of anything, said Marilla shortly. Why, 3 of those big glasses would have made her sick, even if it had only been cordial. Well, this story will be a nice handle for those folks who are so down on me for making currant wine, although I haven't made any for 3 years ever since I found out that the minister didn't approve. I just kept that bottle for sickness. There, child, don't cry. I can't see as you were to blame, although I'm sorry it happened so. 차라리 너를 혼내는 게 아니라 다이아나를 혼내야지. 그렇게 욕심 부려서 무엇이든 그렇게 세 glassful이나 3컵씩이나 마시고 raspberry cordial을 3컵 마셨어도 아팠을 거야. 그리고 이 스토리 때문에 내가 술 만든다고 싫어하는 사람들이 더 뭐라고 말할 거리가 생겼네. 네, there 이거는 누구를 위로할 때 there, don't cry 이렇게 말을 해요. I must cry, said Anne. My heart is broken. The stars in their courses fight against me, Marilla. Diana and I are parted forever. Oh, Marilla, I little dreamed of this when first we swore our vows of friendship. Don't be foolish, Anne. Mrs. Barry will think better of it when she finds you're not really to blame. I suppose she thinks you've done it for a silly joke or something of that sort. You'd best go up this evening and tell her how it was. 걱정하지 마. 너의 실수가 아니었다는 거를 너의 탓이 아니었다는 거를 너의 잘못이 아니었다는 걸 알면 그냥 풀릴 거야. 용서해 줄 거야. My courage fails me at the thought of facing Diana's injured mother, sighed Anne. I wish you'd go, Marilla. You're so much more dignified than I am. Marilla가 더 품이 있으니까 Marilla가 가면 안 돼요? Likely she'd listen to you quicker than to me. Well, I will, said Marilla, reflecting that it would probably be the wiser course. Don't cry any more, Anne. It will be all right. 아하 하셨는데, 샬럿님, 뭐가 아하일까요? Marilla had changed her mind about its being all right by the time she got back from Orchard Slope. Anne was watching for her coming and flew to the porch door to meet her. Oh, Marilla, I know by your face that it's been no use, she said sorrowfully. Mrs. Barry won't forgive me? 얼굴 보니까 딱 알겠어요. Mrs. Barry가 나를 용서 안 하신대요. Mrs. Barry, indeed, snapped Marilla. Of all the unreasonable women I ever saw, she's the worst. I told her it was all a mistake and you weren't to blame, but she just simply didn't believe me. And she rubbed it well in about my currant wine and how I'd always said it couldn't have the least effect on anybody. I just told her plainly that currant wine wasn't meant to be drunk 3 tumblerfuls at a time, and that if a child I had to do with was so greedy, I'd sober her up with a right good spanking. 네. 네, 누가 말했다를 이게 영화는 그냥 목소리에 그걸로 알 수가 있잖아요. 목소리 톤으로 화가 난 건지 기쁜 건지 슬픈 건지. 근데 책으로는 어떻게 할 수 있어요? 이런 누가 말했다 그냥 said 이게 아니라 snapped. snap는 뭘까요? 이렇게 확 이렇게 치는 게 snapping jaws of a shark. 이렇게 팍 닿는 게 snap인데 팍 말했다는 거예요. there 덕분에 네. raspberry. 네. raspberry는 여기 P가 있지만 P는 무시할 거예요. raspberry 이겁니다. 라즈베리 이렇게 하지 않고 라즈베리 하면 사음절이지만 이거는 raspberry 삼음절이에요. 네. raz 이렇게 되지 않게 조심하시고 raspberry. All right. And that if a child I had to do with 나랑 관련 있는 아이가 그렇게 3컵씩이나 마시면 그렇게 욕심을 부리면 나는 걔를 sober 우리 저번에 배웠었죠? 술에서 깨는 게 sober이에요. I'd sober her up with a right good spanking. 때려줘 가지고 정신 차리게 할 거라고. Marilla whisked into the kitchen, grievously disturbed, leaving a very much distracted little soul in the porch behind her. Presently, Anne stepped out bareheaded into the chill autumn dusk. Very determinedly and steadily she took her way down through the sere clover field, over the log bridge, and up through the spruce grove, lighted by a pale little moon hanging low over the western woods. Mrs. Barry, coming to the door in answer to the timid knock, found a white-lipped, eager-eyed suppliant on the doorstep. Mrs. Barry에게 사과하러 간 거예요, 직접. Her face hardened. Mrs. Barry was a woman of strong prejudices and dislikes, and her anger was of the cold, sullen sort, which is always hardest to overcome. 네. Her anger was what kind of sort? 화났을 때 어떻게 화낸다고요? cold, 차갑고 뚱한. 그냥 버럭 화내면 버럭 화내는 사람은 주로 그냥 금방 다시 식는데 그냥 계속 뚱뚱하게 삐지는 사람이라는 거죠. To do her justice, she really believed Anne had made Diana drunk out of sheer malice prepense, and she was honestly anxious to preserve her little daughter from the contamination of further intimacy with such a child. To do her justice. 이런 말은 그녀의 편을 좀 들자면 정말로 앤이 고의적으로 나쁜 마음으로 했다고 생각을 했어요. What do you want? She said stiffly. Anne clasped her hands. Clasped her hands 이거예요. Oh, Mrs. Barry, please forgive me. I did not mean to intoxicate Diana. 취하게 하려고 하지 않았어요. How could I? 내가 어떻게 그러겠어요? Just imagine if you were a poor little orphan girl that kind people had adopted and you had just one bosom friend in all the world. Do you think you think you would intoxicate her on purpose? I thought it was only raspberry cordial. I was firmly convinced it was raspberry cordial. Oh, please, don't say that you won't let Diana play with me anymore. If you do, you will cover my life with a dark cloud of woe. 생각해 보세요. 내가 어떻게 다이아나를 술에 취하게 일부러 할 수 있겠어요? 당신이 불쌍한 고아라고 생각해 보세요. 어떤 친절한 사람들이 고아를 입양해서 이 세상에서 단 한 명의 절친이 있는데 그런 친구를 일부러 취하게 하겠어요? 네. This speech, which would have softened good Mrs. Lynde's heart in a twinkling, had no effect on Mrs. Barry except to irritate her still more. She was suspicious of Anne's big words and dramatic gestures and imagined that the child was making fun of her. So she said coldly and cruelly, I don't think you are a fit little girl for Diana to associate with. You'd better go home and behave yourself. 네. 이 스피치가 미세스 린드에게 말했더라면 그냥 단숨에 순식간에 마음을 녹였을 텐데 미세스 베리에게는 전혀 효과가 없었어요. Except 더 짜증나게 만들었어요. 왜냐하면 앤의 큰 단어들과 드라마틱한 제스처들이 몸짓들이 너무 의심스러웠어요. Anne's lip quivered. Won't you let me see Diana just once to say farewell? She implored. 이별하게 한 번만 보게 해주시면 안 돼요? Diana has gone over to Carmody with her father, said Mrs. Barry, going in and shutting the door. Anne went back to Green Gables calm with despair. My last hope is gone, she told Marilla. I went up and saw Mrs. Barry myself, and she treated me very insultingly, Marilla. I do not think she is a well-bred woman. There is nothing more to do except to pray, and I haven't much hope that that'll do much good because, Marilla, I do not believe that God himself can do very much with such an obstinate person as Mrs. Barry. 네, 뭐라고 했죠? 앤이 무랄라에게 미스 베리는 양반 같은 사람은 아닌 것 같아요. 점잖은 사람 같지 않아요. 너무 사람이 별론 것 같아. 하나님 자체도 이렇게 고집 세고 완강한 사람은 어떻게 못할 것 같아요. 한번 우리 라방을 해 봐야겠어요. 네. 그래서 제가 코칭해 드릴게요. Anne, you shan't say such things, rebuked Marilla, striving to overcome that unholy tendency to laughter which she was dismayed to find growing upon her. And indeed, when she told the whole story to Matthew that night, she did laugh heartily over Anne's tribulations. 너무 맞는 말을 하니까 어린애가 그렇게 양반 같지 않다 그러고. 네. Well bred. 정말 아이들이 하는 말이 아니죠. But when she slipped into the east gable before going to bed and found that Anne had cried herself to sleep, an unaccustomed softness crept into her face. Poor little soul, she murmured. 다시요. Poor little soul, she murmured, lifting a loose curl of hair from the child's tear-stained face. Then she bent down and kissed the flushed cheek on the pillow. 네, 그래서 너무 웃겼는데 앤의 시련들이 너무 많잖아요. 그래서 웃었다가 나중에 들어가서 보니까 눈물이 아직 tear stained 얼굴에 말라 있어요. 눈물이. 그래서 너무 불쌍하다 하고 she kissed the flushed cheek. Alright, 네, 끝났습니다. How did you enjoy this chapter? 너무 불쌍하죠? 불쌍하고 웃기고. 네. Next week, we're going to be doing chapter 17. Chapter 17 is also a long one, so we're just going to be doing one chapter next week. All right. Thank you for listening and watching. Good night.